Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 14th of April 2023. Before we go to the frontline, I won't dwell too long, but just it's worth looking at ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, that in the beginning of their daily report, when in their discussion points, talk about how a Ukrainian official has warned that Russia can reconstitute itself as a serious threat to Ukraine in the long run, despite facing severe force generation problems at this time. But then the ISW goes on to say, well, the Kremlin has not yet undertaken the necessary reorganization of its war effort to effectively leverage economies of scale to support large-scale Russian force generation, however. So in principle they could, but they're just not doing it. And this leaves Russia, I would suggest, in a very difficult predicament now, because they are just on the cusp of receiving a Ukrainian counteroffensive, and have possibly exhausted their troops to the point of, are they going to be able to effectively defend the positions they have? They have not taken the decision to do a mass mobilization, or at least if they are, it's kind of they're sort of doing it, but not in the official way that people were expecting. Right, let's go to the northeast sector, the Kupiansk to Svatva to Kreminna front line. There is a little bit of news actually going on around here today compared to the relative silence we've had of late. Russian forces continued limited ground attacks along the Svatva to Kreminna line on April the 13th. Geolocated footage published on April the 12th indicates that Russian forces likely advanced south of Vuhledar, south of Kreminna, and we'll come to that in a second. If we look at Poulet Volon's map here, around Svatova, there's a rare yellow arrow indicating an attack towards Krivoshivka. And indeed, that is mentioned, I think, down here. Ukrainian forces conducted a partially successful counterattack near Krivoshivka, northwest of Svatova, aiming to take control over the section of the N26 highway. So we come to look at that on my map here. We have Kupiansk up here, Svatova down here, and then around the Kuzmivka area, there's probably still fighting going on in Kuzmivka, but this is a counterattack around here towards Krivoshivka. It could be an attempt to actually encircle Kuzmivka as a way of taking that place, rather than fighting through it from the heights in Novoselivska, which is just here, higher ground than Kuzmivka. Coming down there, there seems to be a bit of back and forth over there for months now without any real change in territory, in total. And then the usual places mentioned, Russian forces deployed. Okay, before we get to listing off all the places that have had repelled attacks, the Russian forces, says the ISW, deployed unspecified motorized rifle units, BARs, so those are combat reserve units, special forces, and additional reconnaissance equipment to the Kreminna area, where a lack of rotations is reportedly leading to poor morale among Russian personnel. So this is to say that in the Kreminna area, there are all sorts of different forces being used: VDV, elite paratroopers, as well as DPR, Donetsk People's Republic forces, kind of militia, as well as reserve forces and regular units. So a bit of a mix. What does that tell you? Some people have claimed that there is an accumulation of Russian equipment possibly in the area, and this could be a place where they are going to do an offensive. Well, I guess they've already been doing an offensive, but it hasn't really amounted to much. They've taken this kind of area here since the beginning of their offensive, and they've been pressuring up and down this line without too much success. Indeed, over the last 24 hours, attacks towards Torska, Mkivka, Nevska, Yempelivka haven't really amounted to much. So these are Torska, Nevska, Makivka, Yempelivka. Over here. So usual sort of places there, but interesting that the Ukrainians are counter-attacking. Now, we are starting to see some yellow arrows, if we're going to look at Poulet Volon's map, in a lot more places, or in a few more places, I should say, over the last week, we've seen that. Does that indicate, I wonder, that a culmination of the Russians, so that the Ukrainians now, even with their defensive kind of forces, are able to probe and make attacks because the Russians have run out of their own offensive momentum? Rebar pro-Russian source says in Lysychansk sector, active offensive continues near Bilohorivka. LNR People's Militia assault units are pushing the enemy by taking new strategic positions. That's all they have to say about the whole area. So let's go and look a little bit at that. So here, the ISW says that geolocated footage published on April the 12th indicates that Russian forces likely advanced south of Bilohorivka. And what they are referring to here is some footage of Russian troops having IEDs dropped on them from above, from the Ukrainian forces. And they put those Russian troops here. So I'm just going to geolocate that for you. Let's do some live geolocation. Well, we're not geolocating it. We're just having a look at it on a map. So this indicates that there are some Russian troops there getting attacked by the Ukrainians with IEDs. So they are moving around these areas. And indeed, if we look at Syriac maps indicates that the Russians have made gains. They say, this is a pro-Russian mapper saying, Ukrainian-Russian war, day 414 situation in Bilohorivka axis. During the last 2 weeks, the Russian army and LPR forces have managed to regain some positions east and south of the town. Indeed, this is where the Ukrainians have pushed back a couple of weeks ago and taken an area around Bilohorivka. There's high ground. There are mountainous areas around Bilohorivka. And it's quite difficult for the Russians to make many gains around here, but they can. The Bilohorivka itself is just rubble. It's been pretty much destroyed, so that they are able to make gains back and forward here. Both sides, sort of bit of yo-yo activity there, but it appears that the Russians have made some gains in and around Bilohorivka. I don't know whether they will be able to capitalize on them. We'll see over the coming days. I've left the Ukrainian lines there to give you an indication of where the Ukrainians were and what the Russians have gained. And there is some geolocated footage to suggest that the Russians are indeed in that area to confirm that. If we come and look at Poulet Boulogn's maps, we have activity north of Kreminna, so the Ukrainians still pushing there. Haven't heard much else about that since we heard that they took back some territory just around the Chervonopopivka area. They are pushing around Ploshchanka towards Makivka quite a lot, and then we're back down to the area just around where we were talking about, Bilohorivka. The only other thing the ISW says is that there were HIMARS strikes on Svatova yesterday, so that the HIMARS are still active in and around the area. Okay, let's move to Bakhmut from Bilohorivka here. So we're going to come out and move down to the north here. We're going to have a little look at what No Reports has to say concerning the northern area. North of Vuhledar, I reported a few days ago that Russian troops, important not Wagner, but Russian troops are positioned on the flanks of Bakhmut. Actually, these are almost certainly VDV, so the supposedly elite troops, paratrooper troops, and they've restarted the offensive around Vasyukivka, Sako, Ivan Seti. For now, that's just shelling. There are no fights as of yet. I actually sort of called him out on that because he said that they're advancing there, and I showed the geolocated footage of troops hiding under a bridge and Ukrainians taking out with artillery, and then actually an IFV dropping off some troops to then throw grenades there. So I didn't think that was an advance, but anyway, I don't know whether he's sort of walking that claim back there. And then we might as well go on to his claims of Bakhmut itself. Fighting continues east of the Pivnichny Pond. So this is in the northwest, a large sort of reservoir pond. That Russian troops control the area. It's likely that Russian troops control the area north of the railway line. Wagner posed again at the State District Administration building. Ukrainian sources claim that the Ukrainian troops have regained ground around the MiG monument. This is unconfirmed, so that will be down in the southern area. So perhaps some pushback for the Ukrainians there. War Mapper says this shows this. I don't agree with the war mapper mapping. I think it's slightly generous to the Ukrainians. However, they have sort of closed the gaps towards the railway line over the last day. Russia have continued to secure areas east of the main rail line, but also advanced in the north as well as minor advances in the south. Perhaps they are just particularly cautious in showing advances rather than rushing into it. The UK intelligence says that Russia's re-energized its assault on Bakhmut as forces of the Russian MOD and Wagner Group have improved cooperation. The Ukrainian defense still holds the western districts of the town, but has been subjected to particularly intense Russian artillery fire over the past 48 hours. Wagner assault groups continue to conduct the main advance through the center of the town, while Russian airborne forces, VDV, have released some Wagner units securing the northern and southern flanks of the operation. Ukrainian forces face significant resupply issues, but have made orderly withdrawals from the positions they've been forced to concede. And actually, the Russian VDV are working with the Wagner here quite well, it seems. So here's a geolocated shelling activity of the VDV as they are taking out Ukrainian positions here down in a southern area that's been geolocated to this point. So this is the T0504 road coming in. That's where that shelling is taking place, near to there. That there's been some severe fighting over that, and the Ukrainians did end up pushing the Russians back again from there, if you remember. So there was taking of some of the ground here to the west of this road, and then the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back to the east. So that shelling appears to be geolocated to around there. So the VDV are working in concert with the Wagner, and that will prove to be a problem for the Ukrainians, no doubt. Right, let's go to the ISW. It says the Russian forces continue to make territorial gains in Bakhmut on April 13th. Geolocated footage shows that Russian forces advanced further west into central Bakhmut and made marginal advances in southern and southwestern Bakhmut. And then it gives a load of references to that. So I just want to pick out some of these to see, what they're talking about here. Take, for example, here, so an intersection where it appears the Russian troops are at. Let's go and have a look and see where that is. It's like the lottery, this. So actually, that's really far back. I wouldn't suggest that shows gains at all, particularly. So again, it's worth checking some of these claims out. They are here, so these are destruction of Wagner's who climbed behind a railway. The western part of the railway. This might be the area that Ukrainians have now subsequently retaken. So let's see if that is the case. We'll put this in. Actually, no, this is further up the north. And again, I wouldn't say that shows advances, or at least those advances were made over the last sort of 24 hours, 48 hours ago. So it depends where they're talking about, where they're taking their benchmark date for advances, because that to me doesn't show their advances for the Russians. Then there's evidence that the Ukrainians are blowing up buildings. Here it says blowing up 2 high-rise buildings to slow Wagner's advance, and there's some geolocation confirmed for that. Let's put that in. And actually, I'm going to talk about blowing up building. We've got some fairly impressive footage of the destruction of one such building. Again, that's behind the Russian lines. So, again, when the ISW make these claims about Russian advances, every time I check them out, almost every time, they are not advances, or they're advances, but they're advances from 3 to 4 days ago. Now, one of the bits of evidence is about a tank that was geolocated. So, in fact, that intersection of the tank being used, interesting. So this is this one again. I'm just going to show you that tank footage because it's a T90 tank, and that is here. So that means that the tank, well, it doesn't mean, it is quite possible that this tank was from a few days ago footage of the tank shooting up, probably up this road here. I doubt it'll be being able to hit anywhere within the Ukrainian lines at the moment. Let's go and find that footage. Here's so this is footage of a T90 tank. And that's that T90 tank in use. So I guess the question is, you know, exactly when was that taken? Also, T-90 tank being used, one of their most modern tanks, given that the T-14 Armata is just a hunk of junk and isn't really operational. So the T-90M, most modern tank, being used in Bakhmut. We haven't seen that previously, and I guess that's evidence that Wagner are in cooperation with regular forces to a greater extent. But anyway, that is being geolocated to that position back here somewhere, and that doesn't necessarily indicate, at least advances in the last 24 hours. Okay, so to continue, two prominent mill bloggers posted footage of themselves reportedly in central Bakhmut, signaling possible further Wagner Group advances in the city. And that could indeed be that sort of footage. Russian sources claim that Wagner forces seized an agricultural lyceum, a rail station, and a grain elevator in northern Bakhmut. Now, I reported this 2 days ago, and then it was reported that the Ukrainians took this back the day later. Some people are taking the mickey about the Russians only taking an elevator because it's translated as an elevator, thinking it's probably just like literally an elevator shaft in a shop or something. But actually, the grain elevator is a large contraption to get grain moving and loaded onto trains and whatnot. So this area here was taken by the Russians, and then it was taken back by the Ukrainians. So again, I would suggest that is possibly lagging by 24 hours here. Advisor to the Donetsk People's Republic, the DNR head, Jan Gagin, claimed that Wagner Group forces are close to encircling Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut, but Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin denied his claim. They claimed this 7 weeks ago, right? Prigozhin stated that Ukrainian forces continue to defend Bakhmut and provision and reinforce their forces within the city. So it's still ongoing. It's no different. Ukraine will probably lose ground repeatedly, but it appears that there hasn't been much territorial shifting in Bakhmut. I will show you what Surat Map Pro Russian mapper says of slight gains in the north. The Russians took control over City People's House and Rose Alley, a new block south of it, reaching the streets of Kreminna and Oborony. Meanwhile, clashes with the Ukrainian army continue at the elevator close to Bakhmut railway station 2, which is contested. So actually, Suryat says that is contested rather than under Ukrainian or Russian control. He's saying that that's the area here. The Russians have made some gains here, and I've reflected that in my mapping. Deep State map hasn't got any movement for the Russians in Bakhmut over the last 24 hours. So there's no change there. The difference between the Ukrainian pro-Ukrainian Deep State map in yellow and the pro-Russian Suryat map in red is evident here in the north. But actually, they've aligned quite a lot in the east and somewhat more in the south as well. Okay, let's go to what Polyvalent map shows, which is red arrows everywhere, and then onto the pro-Russian source Rebar. In the north of Bakhmut, heavy positional fighting is taking place near the railway station. The Ukrainian positions, they hold positions and try to counterattack to the south of the main station building. Russian troops are trying to break through the enemy defense line in the southern part of the city, and active hostilities are taking place on Devyatoho Travnia Street, with small advances near the Voda Canal. Airborne troop units have reinforced their positions on the southern flank of the Bakhmut area. Paratroopers artillery is firing from the Kupiansk-Kreminna area, blocking Ukrainian reserves transfer to Bakhmut. This is interesting. So there is, we have seen actually the Ukrainians try and hit mortars in self-propelled mortars and artillery in Klishchivka and Kupiansk areas, and that could well be the support that the VDV are providing for Wagner, taking over the activity in both the northern areas, the northern flank and the southern flank of Bakhmut. So this is now the purview of the conventional Russian forces, or at least possibly the elite Russian forces, and they are using arguably their own mortars and artillery to attempt to wreak havoc on the Ukrainians, particularly in their attempts to resupply their forces in Bakhmut. Sorry, had to stop for a tea break. So, two more things to add. I showed you some video footage of this tank being blown up, and the video footage was taken by someone sitting under this bridge, very close to that tank. And turns out that was the Ukrainians blowing their own tank up, although it had been immobilized, I think, by a Russian mortar. That tank was this T-80 that the Ukrainians had captured in March of last year from the Russians, and it became a bit of an iconic tank. And they called it Bunny, and it took out 6 enemy tanks. There's some claiming that it's taken out 15, but nonetheless, it was a bit of an iconic tank. Anyway, they've lost it now. It got kind of stuck, immobilized, and they blew it up themselves. So that was just the history behind that footage that I showed you. Now, I'm going to show you one last thing for Bakhmut. This is a pretty impressive bit of footage showing the explosion of some high-rise, the detonations, so high-rise buildings. I mean, that entirely fell down, and you wouldn't want to be hanging out in that building. There's a huge amount of fire, huge amount of damage, and it looks like that second building was taken out as well. So 2 high-rise buildings destroyed. These buildings provide really good vantage points and cover for things like snipers, for spotters, so on and so forth. So if the Russians are going to have these buildings, that provides an advantage for them over the Ukrainians. You see these other buildings on fire. I mean, Bakhmut is just a hellscape. It's Marinka 2.0. Now, as they retreat, the Ukrainians are doing the sensible thing, which is taking out those buildings so that the Russians can't utilize them for their own advantage. Let's see the geolocation of such a building. Whack that in our search bar here. Those buildings appear to be, again, behind the enemy lines, at least, as they have been over the last, as the Russians have advanced over the last week or so. They've taken this territory, but the Ukrainians have, in this case, blown those 2 high-rise buildings up so that the Russians are unable to get a good view over the Ukrainian troops nearby. And that explosion, you don't know, that might have been taken 2 days ago, and that footage was recorded that night, and it's only just coming out now, rather than that actually happening last night. I don't know. Or it'd be interesting if the Ukrainians wait till the buildings get filled with with Russian soldiers and then blow it up. I don't know. So who knows what the rationale exactly is there? But that's what's been going on in Bakhmut. We have seen no real gains other than perhaps some gains for the Russians in this northern area. This grain elevator area next to the railway is at least contested, possibly back in Ukrainian hands, but I'd imagine it's contested. Same for this area south of the railway station here, or at the railway station. And then there'll be fierce fighting all over the rest of Bakhmut too. As far as the ISW says, for the rest of Bakhmut, claims, Kromova, Bodanivka, Prechene in the southwest of Bakhmut, Wagner, VDV, sorry, the airborne VDV working in Vasyukivka to the north. So all around Bakhmut is still, there's pressure there. But as we come on to Avdivka, so as we come out of that, so Bodanivka is in this area, Kromove is on the way in to the north there. But as you can imagine, there's activity all over the shop. As we come down to Avdivka, not too much information about Avdivka, other than usual repelled attacks, Pervomaisky towards Siverny just here. There is a little bit of map movement up here, which I sort of indicated yesterday was on the cards. Situation north of Avdivka, the Russian army and DPR captured a small section of the H20, which is a road west of Novobakhmutivka 3 days ago. Artillery would constantly bomb this position, strongly fortified by the Ukrainian soldiers, and that's all been geolocated and whatnot. And this is just literally a tiny bit of road there, as you can see from Syriac map. So just not particularly life changing, but it is some gain. The ISW say that all the usual culprits around the area are being hit, but or there are repelled attacks around there. There is apparently heavy fighting in Marinka and Pobyeda, which is just south of Marinka, but again, no changes of territory in either place, as far as I know. And Warmapper says that there have been no confirmed changes to control since the last update. That is their interpretation of what's going on. So let's go and move south then. So as we come out on my map, there's no news. Well, there is. You've heard a little bit of news about Marinka there, but there's no news about Vuhledar just to the south of there. As I readjust my map, going crazy because of my stupid fingers. So Marinka, heavy fighting, but no explicit news. And then Vuhledar, no news of activity around there. It claims that there are no other attacks in the Donetsk, Western Donetsk Oblast. We do have some claims about Roboterny, which is just to the south of Orikhiv. Where are you? There you are, Roboterny. So the ISW claim that a Russian source claimed that Ukrainian forces continued reconnaissance and force operations in Zaporizhia Oblast on the 13th. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces conducted probing attacks near Russian defenses in the vicinity of Roboterny. Now, we saw some failed Ukrainian attack a couple of weeks ago where they lost quite a bit of equipment there, and then indeed I think Russian activity around there as well. So that is well within the Russian territory, but that's reconnaissance and force. That's what you would expect. Sort of going to gather information, but have the ability to do some fighting as well. The RSW sort of speaks a lot again about the defensive fortifications being built all around the Zaporizhia area on the front line, but also mining around a nuclear power plant. In fact, one of those mines recently detonated near the control room of the fourth power unit at the facility. So, it's a bit dodgy to say the least. Other than that, not too much to report. No explicit news about the Dnipro River area, Kherson, Kimburn Peninsula, Crimea, or indeed really the Zaporizhia Oblast and much of Western Donetsk or southwestern Donetsk. So relatively quiet in many respects, just the usual flashpoints of Bakhmut, Marinka's tough fighting, Avdivka area, but also some activity up in the Kreminna area as well, Horivka. There are interesting information coming out of the Daily Telegraph, their Ukraine the latest podcast, and some articles they have on partisan activity in Melitopol, growing partisan activity there that could be quite useful for both morale and having more tangible kind of ramifications as well. Anyway, worth checking that out. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate all the wonderful support I get from you guys. It is quite incredible, and yeah, hugely grateful for that. Anyway, take care, and I'll hang out with you a little bit later for an extra. Just to let you know that tomorrow morning, Saturday morning, UK time, and it might be for most of the day, I need to look at the timing, but one of my boys, one of my twins, has a rugby tournament over the coast in Bournemouth, and so that's going to require me being away and unable to do the news and frontline update. At least if I do it, it will be well into the afternoon. So I do apologise, but if you can wait, it might come later, or you just might have to wait till Sunday. Anyway, thank you so much. Speak later.